So I am pleased to welcome Dr. Laura Wallace, who is a principal researcher at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD from Ohio State University and completed a postdoctoral position at George Mason University. Her research program integrates work in attitudes, persuasion, social cognition, motivation, and intergroup relations to understand mechanisms underlying social change. She also happens to be my very good friend. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wallace.
Hey everybody, it's great to be here with you this morning. I know Andy said you can drop questions in the chat. It's also fine with me if you just interrupt. I'm not good at managing the chat, but if you want to just verbally toss out questions in the middle of the talk, that's fine with me. And in fact, I'm going to start my talk by asking you a question. Gotta make sure that, okay, there it is. So I'm going to start my talk with this quote from Wells Fargo. This is taken from their website. It says, "The history of Wells Fargo is about more than our past. Our history has roots that continue today and set the foundation for tomorrow." So my question for you is, if you were browsing a company's website and you encountered this kind of quote, what kind of inferences might you draw about this company? Just toss them out. Anything's welcome.
They may have something to hide.
Maybe there's something to hide. Other things people often say are like, maybe this company is really prestigious, like they have this long history, they've been successful for a long time, they're reliable, they have continued to have success over time. And so people tend to have kind of mixed reactions to this, but at least some people seem to think this is a good idea, that it's helpful for organizations to emphasize this successful history that they've had. In today's talk, however, I will focus on how celebrating organizational history can trigger concerns about belonging among Black Americans, this negative consequence of emphasizing history, which at first glance may seem harmless or even a good idea. Okay, so why should this occur? Well, the basis of this talk is that racism was commonly accepted and widespread in many different forms historically in the United States. And indeed, previous research has suggested that people who have a deeper knowledge of historical racism are more able to recognize systemic racism in the present. So this knowledge of the history of racism is really important in the way that people interpret events in the present. There are also group-based differences in this knowledge. So Black people tend to possess more accurate knowledge of historical racism than white people do, which leads to Black people recognizing systemic racism in the way that the history of racism in our country contributes to group-based inequalities today. So given this, excuse me, that Black people tend to have a lot more knowledge about the history of racism in the United States, let's revisit this quote. Let's imagine a Black person who has a lot of knowledge about the history of racism is looking at this website and they see Wells Fargo talking about their great history. What kind of questions might come to mind? They might start to think like, well, you probably excluded me in your history, or at least members of your organization would have certainly had prejudicial attitudes towards my group, even if I wasn't explicitly marginalized. Why are you celebrating your history? And why are you trying to bring the past into the present? And all of these questions might raise concerns that the people at Wells Fargo either do not understand the history of racism in the United States, or worse, that they wish things were the way they used to be. And either of these may make Black Americans feel concerned that they are not going to be treated well in this organization, that they're not going to feel like they belong. So the overarching hypothesis here is that when organizations celebrate their history, they may trigger social identity threat for Black Americans. When I say social identity threat, I'm referring to the idea that when people realize they may have be devalued in a setting because of one or more of their social identities. You could think about this similarly to stereotype threat, where I'm concerned that I'm going to be negatively judged or treated poorly in a particular setting because of one of my identities. In the social identity threat literature, researchers have put forward the cues hypothesis. And the cues hypothesis says that subtle situational cues can trigger social identity threat even if the setting exhibits no overt evidence of prejudice or discrimination. So this is where you can have racist environments and environments that perpetuate group-based inequalities, even without people who are prejudiced or discriminatory themselves. So the idea here is that if I have an identity that I'm worried will be devalued, I'm vigilant for cues in the environment that I may not belong or may not be treated well. And what we're interested in this talk is that when organizations celebrate their history, it may function as one of these cues that can trigger social identity threat, regardless of whether the people in the organization have any clue at all that this celebrating their history is having this negative kind of effect. Okay, so just to be clear, I'm going to walk you through one more example. Imagine a Black student is a very talented physics student and is interested in pursuing a PhD. The student goes to the Ohio State physics webpage to see, maybe I want to do my PhD at Ohio State, maybe I'll apply. In addition to welcoming them immediately to Ohio State physics, immediately the webpage says they have a world-class physics program with a history of research excellence. And the fact that they're mentioning history right away as almost the first thing on this webpage may trigger for this student, well, who was involved in that history? It certainly would not have been my group. In fact, this department was likely very exclusionary towards this group, or towards my group. As they're scrolling through this webpage, they may encounter things like this photo, which is an aerial view of the physics program, physics building. It's black and white. And they may notice, oh, that's from 1950s. Certainly, my group would not have been included in the physics department at this point. And in fact, my group might have been treated very poorly by the physics department at this point. And so why is Ohio State physics in the present so focused on celebrating this history that was clearly bad for my group? And it may raise concerns about how I would be treated in the present. I'm going to note something about this example. There's no information about representation here. There's no mention of a history of marginalization here. And the hypothesis is that that shouldn't be necessary, right? Just the mention of history and how great it was may trigger these processes, because Black people and other marginalized people tend to have this deep knowledge of how negatively their group was treated historically. Okay, so in the current work, I'm going to test the hypothesis that when organizations celebrate their history, they will undermine Black Americans' sense of belonging and interest in joining the organization. I'm going to show you 3 studies. The first looks at the effect of celebrating history on Black Americans' sense of belonging in that organization. and their interest in joining it. Study 2 is a pre-registered replication, plus we'll examine mediation. And study 3 is an additional pre-registered replication with moderation. So in this initial study, we recruited Black Americans on Mechanical Turk, and we randomly assigned them to encounter an organization whose description celebrated their history or was ahistorical. So the company in these studies is this Mitchell and West Consulting Group. The history condition looks like this, where right on their front page, it says our long history of excellence. And the text says things like, at MWCG, we root our success in our rich history. The ahistorical condition looks similar, except they're focused on their commitment to excellence, and then they're rooting their success in their commitment to excellence. So there's no mention of history in this condition. I want to note, this was the very first study we ran in this line of work. So you will note that on this webpage, we do have these photos of the Whiteman founders. We are also telling participants in this study that the company was founded in Charleston, South Carolina. At the time we ran this study, because it was the first one, we thought maybe these hints that the organization itself had a racist past would be necessary to get the effect. What I suggested earlier is that maybe they aren't. And so I'll address this in future studies, but we were sort of hedging our bets in this initial study. I'll also note that this is true across conditions. And so any differences we observe between the history and the ahistorical condition can't be due to the white dude photograph, but it is possible that this is a necessary condition. Okay, so after participants read all about this company, we asked them about their impressions of the company's values. This is a manipulation check, so how much the company values tradition, history, and heritage. We also want to make sure that this company doesn't seem differentially successful or communal, as those would be good reasons to like a company more. So we're going to control, or we're going to make sure the manipulation doesn't affect their perceived success or their perceived communion as well. The core dependent measures, the first is anticipated belonging in the organization. This is adapted from previous research, but it's captured with items like, how accepted do you think you would feel in this organization? There's 5 items here, so it's not a single item scale. And then intentions to pursue employment in the organization, captured with items like, if you were looking for a new job, how likely would you be to apply for a job at this organization? Okay, so what do we find? I'm going to start with manipulation checks. So on the x-axis here, I have celebrating history versus the ahistorical condition. The y-axis here is how much they value history, with higher numbers indicating more valuing of history. What we find is that, consistent with what we were hoping for a manipulation check, when the organization was celebrating history, people are like, yeah, they value their history. That's a significant difference. And these conditions do not result in significant differences on success and communion. So we know then that the differences in these two conditions can't be attributed to perceptions of success or communion. Okay, but what do we find on the core DVs that we care about? We show that when the organization celebrates its history, people report, these Black participants report that they would be feeling reduced belonging in this organization compared to when the organization's description is ahistorical. And they're also saying they would be less likely to apply to work at this organization. So in this study, we have some initial evidence that celebrating an organization's history can trigger threat for Black Americans. I'll just pause here for a second, and if anybody has questions, you can jump in at this point before the train's too far down the tracks. Okay, onward. So in study 2, we wanted to know can we replicate the effects of the history manipulation without these cues that the organization might have had a racist history. And the idea here is that because racism was so widespread and Black Americans know it was so widespread, we shouldn't have to suggest that this particular organization had a racist past. Black participants should infer that. And so we can get the effect, even without these suggestions, that this organization was racist. Additionally, we're going to examine mediation. And so we're interested in the idea that when organizations are emphasizing their history in this way, it makes them seem racist. It makes the people in that organization seem racist. And that is what is undermining belonging. We also pre-registered the study, and we bumped up the sample size as well. So we recruited Black Americans again. Everybody in these studies is Black, from Prolific. And we got rid of these old white dudes and the information that was founded in Charleston, South Carolina. Instead, we replaced this with a black and white photo of the Chicago skyline, which should be less likely to lead to inferences that this organization in particular had a racist past, although they should generally infer it because of the widespread nature of racism historically. Okay, and then the study is the same, except we're swapping out that photo. We're not telling them it was founded in the South. And then in addition to the measures we had previously, we're including this perceived coworker bias measure, where we're asking how prejudiced do you think the people who work at this organization are? All right, so jumping right to results here, we see that when the organization was celebrating its history, these Black participants infer that the coworkers are more racist than when it doesn't emphasize its history. We additionally replicate the effect on belonging, where when the organization celebrates its history, Black Americans are reporting reduced belonging in that organization. They are also saying they're less willing to apply to work at this organization as well. So I want to note, this is a replication, and we took out those racism cues. So this suggesting that this organization had a racist past is not necessary. Simply celebrating your history with no mention of group membership, no mention of historical racism. There's nothing in here that is about past marginalization of Black people or group membership. It's just celebrating history or not, and we're still seeing the effect. Okay, looking at mediation, we see that consistent with our hypothesis in the history condition, they view the organization as more racist, and then this undermines belonging and their intentions to join the organization, resulting into significant indirect effects. Okay, so we replicated the effect of history on belonging and intentions and showed that this is mediated through perceptions that the coworkers are racist. Okay, in study 3, we wanted to ask the question, is celebrating history necessarily bad? So in the previous 2 studies, I showed you that celebrating a history should be bad when there was clearly or possibly a racist past, when it's not clear what this organization's history was. But it's not that celebrating any history should be bad. If the organization has this history of being diverse and inclusive, then it shouldn't be a problem. If they can say, historically, we have been very inclusive, we should not see these negative effects of celebrating history. So we're gonna, from a design perspective, cross the history manipulation with a diversity or manipulation. This design's a little tricky, so I'm gonna take some time now to just walk you through what that looks like. So we have this no inclusion cue condition. This is exactly the same as what I just showed you. It's the history versus ahistorical conditions with that photo of Chicago. Again, there's none of these racism cue things in these conditions. This is just exactly study 2. But then we're crossing this with an inclusion cue condition. And in the history condition, they're focused on how they have a history of diversity and inclusion. And in the ahistorical condition, they're focused on how in the present they value diversity and inclusion and actually are quite diverse. Okay. So again, I'm just trying to make this very clear because I do think it's a little confusing. Okay, so this is this exact same, this no diversity information history condition is exactly the same as the history condition from the last study. The diverse history condition looks like this, where the black and white photo is suddenly a number of Black men who are the ostensible founders of this organization. And the text says things like, we believe that the strong history of diversity and inclusion in our company is the cornerstone of our success. So they're still celebrating their history. It's just now they're celebrating how diverse and inclusive that history has been. In the ahistorical conditions, again, no diversity information. Ahistorical condition is the same as it was in study 2. However, in the present, there's this black and white photo again to match tone, but it's people in modern clothing. These are all Black folks, and they're saying things like, we believe diversity and inclusion are the cornerstones of our success. So they're emphasizing that they have this present diversity and inclusion. Okay, so what do we find? So to present these results, I've put the diversity factor on the x-axis. So on the left, there's no diversity information. That's where we should see replication. And then on the right is the diverse conditions. The blue bars are celebrating history. The gray bars are ahistorical. So first, I'm just going to show you the no diversity information conditions. This is where we should see a replication of what I've been showing you. And indeed, we replicate. So when the organization celebrates their history, Black participants are reporting that they would experience reduced belonging compared to the organization with an ahistorical description. However, there is a significant interaction. When the organization has a history of diversity inclusion or a present of diversity inclusion, first of all, there's a main effect where Black Americans are suddenly like, yep, this seems good, I would belong here. But there's also no effect of history in this condition. And like, if anything, it's reverses, but that's not really there. We see the same exact pattern of results on application intentions, where they're in the when no information about diversity is provided, the Black Americans are less likely to apply compared to the ahistorical condition, but that effect vanishes as long as the organization is diverse, either historically or in the present. Okay, so in study 3, we have even more evidence that celebrating history triggers social identity threat among Black Americans. I also showed you, though, that it's not that celebrating any history is bad. The negative effects of celebrating history vanished when that history was actually diverse and inclusive. Okay, so just to summarize here, across 3 studies, I've shown you that when organizations celebrate their history, this leads to lower belonging and intentions to pursue employment among Black Americans. I've shown you that this can happen in the absence of any explicit reference to group membership or past marginalization. Black Americans seem to infer this all on their own, just with the mention of history, presumably because of the widespread nature of historical racism. This effect seems to occur through inferences that their current coworkers would be racist to them. And this effect is mitigated when the history celebrated is actually diverse and inclusive. So some implications, it is really common for organizations to celebrate their history. So if you Google almost any organization and say organization plus history, you will probably find some sort of, this is how great our history is webpage. Even if it's not front and center like the Ohio State Physics Department. It's quite common, in fact, for organizations to employ organizational historians whose entire job is to understand the history of the organization and to communicate about it. And so it is quite common for organizations to do this. Yet, it's not clear to me that people generally understand that this can have a negative effect on Black Americans, although if someone was really cynical, they might say, people know exactly what they're doing. Importantly, this may contribute to group-based disparities in organizations. So when Black Americans are deciding where to apply, they may be less likely to apply to organizations that are putting their history front and center. Like I said, this is really common, so that's knocking out a bunch of organizations. Or they may apply to these organizations and yet bring these concerns about belonging with them, which can undermine their performance in addition to their well-being. And thinking about where to take this work going forward, this talk has been all about Black Americans, but the theory isn't about Black Americans, it's about historically marginalized groups. And so the theory predicts that women in STEM should experience these kinds of results. Gay people and other people with sexual minority identities may experience these kinds of effects. We started with Black Americans because that history is so prominent and extreme that we were more confident in finding these effects, but the theory predicts that this should extend to other marginalized groups, though we have not tested that. So in the last study, I showed you that when the history is diverse and inclusive, these effects vanish. That's not a good test, actually, of like, what if the present is really diverse and inclusive? So if you're a part of an organization where it really is diverse and inclusive, people are valued, everyone feels like they belong, maybe it's okay for organizations to celebrate their history a bit, because it's not as diagnostic a cue about who is valued in the environment. So that's a really important open question, and there may be other cues that are more diagnostic about how you're going to be treated in a given environment. Do white people understand the negative effects that this has for Black people? I have some ongoing work that I can tell you about if someone wants to ask me about it, that suggests at least some white people do understand this and others don't. And lastly, I think an important future direction is to understand what happens when organizations apologize or acknowledge their racist history. So that's sort of the other side of the coin of what I've been talking about. Is I've been talking about situations when organizations are just super positive towards their past and they don't mention any sort of racism in their past. However, a path forward might be for organizations to actually say, we screwed up And there are many organizations in the present that really screwed up. Wells Fargo had ties historically to the slave trade, and acknowledging those kinds of ties may be important, an important way to move forward. Okay, I'll stop chatting at you for now. Thank you for listening, and I'd love to chat more. So please ask questions if you have them.
I'll pipe in to get the things rolling. So your future directions did a very nice job of addressing everything I wrote down on my post-it note here. I mean, I am curious about the question of how white people respond to this, right? Because you sort of set this up as this is something that this group doesn't acknowledge as like potentially problematic. If anything, they see it as something great. And so I'm just curious, like what do we know about when the same thing is shown to white folks? Do they value the history? Do they realize that, oh, this could be like, if the question is targeted at like, would this be an effective recruitment tool if you want to promote diversity? Do white folks see this as like, yeah, no problem? Or do they go, well, but like maybe?
Yeah, okay, so I have two different answers to that. So one is we set these conditions up so that they're perceived as equally successful, but that may not be true if we didn't want to control for that, if that makes sense. So it's possible that in a different situation, the historical company would be perceived as more successful. I'm not totally sure about that. We don't find differences with this manipulation. But then to answer your question about white people, the core determining factor in whether white people understand this is their political ideology. So if you show people the history versus ahistorical companies and ask them, how racist do you think this company is? How racist do you think the people who work at this company are? White liberals say the people who work at the history company are racist more than the ahistorical. White conservatives show no difference in that inference. Past work has suggested that white liberals have a better understanding of historical racism, and so they're probably drawing on the same information that Black people are when they're saying, well, you're really emphasizing your history, and that history was probably racist. So it seems like you might be racist in the present. What's interesting is that conservative Black participants also don't show this effect. So it's not actually that all Black participants find this historical emphasis threatening. The effect is really driven by Black liberals, and of course we know Black people tend to be liberal in general, but Black conservatives don't show this effect.
So the finding with white respondents being able to, like when asked, be able to assume that maybe this organization has a racist past, like do they have to be cued, right? Because what's so striking about this is just that word history, no questions about like, hey, what might that history have been like? Black respondents are able to say sort of on average, like, there's a red flag here. And I wonder if unprompted, would white respondents have the same? Like they could be guided to pay attention to that, but are they spontaneously making that inference in the way that it seems like these respondents are?
In the studies with white participants, the materials are the same, where there's no, the same as studies 2 and 3, where there's no little hints that this organization had a racist past. It's just history or no. So it seems like,
but I just mean the question, the survey question is asking a targeted, like, hey, tell us, is there something potentially suspect here? As opposed to just like, would this be an inclusive place for employees of color?
Got it. Right, we have open text responses, but they come after the questions about how racist is this organization. So I think it's top of mind by the time participants are filling that out. So it's a good question, and I don't know, but I do think it would be worth studying in the future.
All right. I will silence again and let the group pipe up. All right, we all know that if nobody asks questions, I'm going to. Oh, perfect. We have something coming up in the chat. Can you speak a little bit about what you found so far about white people understanding / their perceptions of negative effects for Black people when history is emphasized? Is this, and maybe Mariah can clarify whether this is different, whether this is a different, my reading of this question is similar to what Laura was just talking about, but
yeah, so this was right when you started deviating into it. This was pretty similar to what you were talking on or speaking on.
We haven't, I guess, to just say a little bit about this, one version of the study is we could say, do you think this organization would make Black people feel like they don't belong? And we have never asked that question, but an assumption we're making is that when they say this organization is racist, that captures that idea. Although if you wanted to poke at my research, you could say, well, that's not really precise. Okay, could this be connected to Make America Great Again? And how could that be triggering for Black Americans? I think that is a totally great connection. So the materials we used include the phrase, like we try to go back to the good old days, which I think is similarly triggering because whose good old days is it? And this Make America Great Again slogan captures that same idea of like, if we could just rewind, if we could go back in the past, things would be great. Again, they would be better. And of course, we know that's not true for Black Americans. So yeah, I think this slogan would have the same effects. I think it also speaks to the political ideology effects that I was just talking about, where this is a conservative slogan. A generous way of thinking about the slogan is that the conservatives don't understand the negative effect this would have on Black Americans, and a less generous interpretation would be they know exactly what they're doing and are being racist on purpose. Okay, when you talk about future research with other marginalized groups, are you referring to, for example, LGBT people looking at a company with an anti-LGBT history, or LGBT people looking at a company with a racist history, which may then lead people to think they are also anti-LGBT, or are both directions important to consider? So great question. Last question first, both are important to consider. So one thing I wanna call attention to, in the current work, in studies 2 and 3, and in the follow-up, basically all the follow-up studies we've done, we don't include any information about whether the organization has a racist history at all. There's no cues, there's no photo of white men, there's no suggestion that this organization is in the South. It really just is like, they're like, our history is great, or it's not. Or just like, we don't mention history at all, right? And so I think I could take the exact materials we use, because they don't talk about racism at all, or whether the company was racist, and import that into a study and look at effects among LGBT folks. And my prediction is that we would see the same effect. I think this is especially true to the extent that it's a domain where LGBT folks would be concerned about being discriminated against. I suspect a workplace would work just fine, given how widespread, especially historically, LGBT discrimination was in workplaces. But I'd have to think a little bit more carefully about that. That said, oh my gosh, I'm gonna blank on her name right now. Look up a young assistant professor at UConn who did her PhD at Rutgers. I'll think of her name as soon as we get off Zoom. She has really interesting work on sort of spillover effects, where when you see someone be racist, if you're a member of another stigmatized group, you infer they're likely to be prejudiced towards your group as well. And so we could think about a different study where instead of omitting information about past prejudice and marginalization, we could tell people this organization was racist historically and ask LGBT folks, do you think that they are likely to discriminate against you? And I think that would also be a really interesting question as well.
To kind of follow up on that, I had sort of two questions about study 3 and the way you manipulated, like making explicit diversity history. Part 1 was wondering like whether making explicit racial diversity history would increase belonging for other stigmatized groups, right? Like, would there be a spillover effect in that direction, right? In this case, a more favorable way. And the other is, I was actually a little surprised that the diversity information was like, especially in the historical condition, set the stage of not necessarily like diversity, but of like Black leadership specifically, right? So like, there's an inference maybe that this is, I can't articulate quite what the like confound would be. Whereas it's just a little bit different than saying like, oh, this is the same. You might make the same inference about the kind of company and like the leadership makeup, but a different inference about the values that they have about the employment decisions, as opposed to maybe making different inferences about like representation and leadership, which is diversity, but it just wasn't the manipulation I expected.
Okay, sorry, Andy. I think you said a couple of things, and I think I lost track of the first thing you said. Oh, inferences, right. So I do think, so if we showed these materials to, for example, women in STEM or LGBTQ folks, I do think we would find spillover here, where even though this is a bunch of Black dudes, I think people would infer that this is a more inclusive organization. One confound I'll tell myself a little bit about is that we do actually have Black women in this photo, but not this photo, and that's because of sexism. So we literally could not find a photo of Black men and women in a business setting together. In a historical way. Whereas, of course, in the present, if there were no women here, people would start to be like, what's going on? Okay, the other point you're making is like, that everybody's Black. It's not a mix. It's not in that sense, it's actually not diverse. It's just Black folks, right?
And particularly in the historical one, it was the founders, right? So it's not simply like, oh, we hire across the board, but like this was conceived as a company by this group of people.
Right. So the same thing I just said is true, which is like in the 1950s, Black and white folks were not really collaborating to start companies. And so you could think about this rather as, it may be more appropriate to describe this as an inclusion cue rather than a diversity cue. But it is absolutely for the participants in our study, their experience is like, this is all of my in-group, not that it's actually diverse in the sense of having lots of different types of people. Yes, Kim Cheney, thank you, Kelsey. That's who I was talking about, who does that inferences across groups. Oh, sorry, I realized that was a direct message. Kelsey messaged me and said that Kim Cheney is the one who does the cross inferences. And yes, it's Kim Cheney, go look her up. She does good work.
It's okay that you outed me, Laura. I was just trying to help you out.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But while we're on this conversation of like how inclusive are these inclusive cues, right? I think the other little twist on that I'll just add into the mix is, you know, we tend to think of, I think we're guilty of this across the field of thinking about this black-white binary and forgetting about all these other racial groups, right? And so my question would be, right, how do the other racial minority groups feel about these messages? And maybe in particular groups who don't have the same kind of history of discrimination in the US, so groups who maybe are, they're stigmatized in the US currently, but haven't been a group that's been, I don't know, on our radars in the same historical way that like Black Americans have. So I'm thinking maybe, you know, Middle Eastern folks, for example, post 9/11, that became a big group that, you know, we focused in on in terms of prejudice. So just wondering if you could speak to that.
First of all, sorry, my cat is obsessed with me and needed attention, so I'm just gonna hold her. But yeah, my prediction is that people from the Middle East wouldn't show these effects because it really is about knowing your group's history and knowing that you were discriminated against. So I guess that's my first reaction. My second reaction is a counter argument to that, which is if this is about inferences across groups, and if that can happen, then folks from the Middle East who may have concerns about being negatively stereotyped chronically may use this sort of, may recognize that history would signal negative attitudes towards Black Americans and therefore infer prejudice towards their own group as well. So I guess I could see it going either way, which makes it an interesting hypothesis to test. The other version of that is to say, what about groups with a negative history, but with relatively good standing now? So like Japanese Americans, who of course were interned, but are a relatively high status group at this point in history. And again, I think I could make predictions either way. We started with Black Americans because the prediction was clear. Okay, there's also in the chat, in this study, it was an organization, and in the beginning you mentioned schools like Ohio State. Are there other contexts you think this could apply to? Could it possibly affect people's evaluations of others? Maybe they hear person A's family has a long history in the United States. Okay, so there's two really interesting things in this question. One is about context. So I'm going to start with that. In terms of context, I predict that this effect would extend to contexts where people have concerns that they will be negatively stereotyped. So I do think this would extend to schools, especially for people who tend to have negative stereotypes about their intelligence, and that might be top of mind. So yeah, I do think though, like when we think about would women show these effects, I think maybe they actually wouldn't show these effects in an organizational setting because there are less negative stereotypes about women in business than there are, for example, in STEM. And it may have to be a space where these like concerns about negative stereotypes are chronic. Okay, then there's a second really interesting question, which is, could it affect people's evaluations of others? Maybe they hear this person's family has a long history. So I want to draw a distinction between having a long history and celebrating history. So this is actually a confound we were asked to address in the peer review process. And so I didn't present this study today, but we have some evidence that if you hold constant how long the organization has been in existence, we still get effects of celebrating that history. So we run a study where the organization celebrates their history, or in the alternative condition, they say, many people are surprised to hear we've been around for 100 years. And so the time is constant, but they are not celebrating that history. And in fact, they're saying like, we have changed, we are not the same as the past, in the past before. So that's an important distinction. Second of all, I do think this probably affects evaluations of individuals. If, I mean, there are some people who just walk around and are like, you know, back in my day, things were so much better. Like, it's really pretty common to hear people say that. And I do think probably, especially folks from groups with a history of marginalization, and for like, if you think things were really good when you were young, maybe you're kind of racist. So good questions, thank you. Okay, would you please briefly repeat what you mentioned regarding political ideology being the core variable determining whether history cues were understood, specifically Black conservatives? Correct. We thought, okay, so these are follow-up studies I didn't present here today, but we present the same information, the same kind of conditions that I showed you here today to white and Black people, and we measure their political ideology. So we can look at effects among white people and Black people and among liberals and conservatives. I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important and relevant. We thought Black people in general might be more likely than white people to say that the company that celebrates its history was racist. We did not find that. So Black people and white people seem equally likely to say that the company that emphasizes its history is more racist than the company that doesn't. What does really determine whether there is a difference between the history condition and the no history condition is people's political ideology. So liberals, regardless of whether they are white or Black, infer that the organization that emphasizes its history is more racist than the one that doesn't. Conservatives, regardless of whether they are white or Black, do not show this effect. So there's no difference in how much they perceive the history versus the ahistorical company description. I think while I'm talking about this, I think that's actually important more broadly than just this effect, because I think it says something about the psychology of Black conservatives. It suggests that maybe they are not aware of the history of racism in the same way that liberals are, or that they think it's less likely to come into the present. Like, we hear this narrative sometimes like, yeah, racism existed, but it's in the past. And Black conservatives may be applying that ideology to themselves. And if we think about the psychology of social identity threat, you can take one of two approaches in coping with this concern that your group may be negatively stereotyped. The one that's most commonly studied is that you're vigilant for cues and that you show reduced belonging when there are these cues that suggest you might not belong there. You show reduced performance when you're distracted by concerns that you might not belong. The other that's consistent with dissonance is to deny, right? To opt out, to say, yeah, that may happen, but it's not true for me. Or yes, that happened in the past, but it's not true today, and I can succeed just like everyone else. So that's a less commonly studied path of social identity threat, but there is some work on it, especially work on people de-identifying with domains. So anyway, that was rambly, but hopefully it answered your question.
Very cool. Well, I think in the interest of time, we ought to thank Dr. Wallace for this presentation, and thanks to everybody for coming.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun, and thanks for all the interesting questions.